Joan, can you tell us a little bit about the program that you were a part of in Venezuela, and in what capacity were you part of it?
Sure. I was working for a nonprofit organization who basically our mission was to advance democracy, I would say. So a lot of it had to do with overseeing elections and working with local partners, sharing best practices, bringing in the international community. And so I was part of many election observation missions throughout all of Latin America, including El Salvador, Mexico, Guatemala. And so our work in Venezuela started even, I mean, it started a long time ago. And when we started working in Venezuela, we were able to work like we do in all countries with all parties, including the party of Chavez. But as the situation advanced, we were no longer able to work with the Chavismo, and we were also kicked out of the country. And so a lot of it had to, s- so a lot of the other work that then I did was actually bringing people from Venezuela. And I'm not talking about just the political leaders, but people associated with university, researchers, people that were, sympathetic also to the government to see and be part of other elections and see how other elections work in Latin America in order for them to be able to safeguard their own elections. And so that was a little bit of the work that I was doing in Venezuela. I was basically managing all those programs.
And it sounds like, sorry, it sounds like if you're saying that the program was kicked out of Venezuela, it must have been because Hugo Chavez probably saw that somehow it was not to his benefit to have you guys there, right? Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Sure. I mean, it's not just there was a specific law that prohibited any nonprofit organizations to receive funding from outside of Venezuela. And so that's very broad, but it wasn't just NGOs, like is more, as Chavez had more power and he just silenced anything that would be in opposition of him, including not just international organizations, but the media within Venezuela. Anyone that really would speak out against him, he would, pass different laws to silence people.
Yeah, I think that you brought up the media, and I think that's a point that I've wanted to get clarified, because we always hear about Venezuela as it being a socialist country where the government has like a hand in everything, but didn't they have private like media, news, and radio companies that were often very critical of Chavez, or did he completely dismantle all of those private media companies, and all of them were just state run companies? Because I don't think.
He slowly dismantled all of them. So yeah, first he would start with one and then another one, and then yeah, until the point that there's no one that can speak against
But that
the
means
government.
but didn't I think recently the part of what.
So
Go ahead.
then I mean, yeah, like no, in terms of what's ran in television and what Venezuelans could see, no. But the thing with Venezuela is that they're very active on social media. And so that's one thing that I think the government has not been able to completely shut down, and that's how especially young people have organized. I mean, Chavez also himself took advantage of social media like no other president in Latin America had before. He was the first one really on Twitter even before we had Trump. Um, but yeah, in terms of the actual like the private cable news outlets that they existed for a long time, but eventually, and especially during Maduro, everything's out of the air.
Right, that's what I was going to ask you. So I think wasn't it recently what sparked some of the protests was that a license for a radio station wasn't going to be renewed. I think that must have been a privately owned station, and I forget what year that was. It may have been 2014. I don't know if or if that was before Chavez or after Chavez. But are you saying though then that by the time of Chavez's death, there was no private media company that was either on television, radio, or newspaper? Because I don't think that that doesn't sound like what I've read.
I don't know exactly the details, to be quite honest with you. I just know that it was a process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of like first one outlet being shut down. Even before like I started working in Venezuela, I saw this from working in the US government, where I would have people from like Human Rights Watch come and meet with me because I was handling international affairs, and that was like one of the big things. So this was like, ooh, I'm talking about 2000 and probably 2006. And so I know that following it, it's been a process. It's like, and there's so many protests. Obviously, every time one outlet would get shut down, there'd be a protest from the opposition. So I don't know, to be to be honest with you, I can't say that everything was shut down before Chavez, but I just it was it's a it's a pattern that was happening from when it started when he was in power. And I don't know that to this point if there's any outlet out there that's still airing that's in opposition.
And,
And the interesting thing is, as some of our listeners may have heard, recently Maduro messed with the golden boy of the U.S. and Mexico, Jorge Ramos, and the crew who was trying to interview him. And I think, obviously, if you know anything of Latin America and the Spanish language news media, you know Jorge Ramos is the Walter Concrete. I don't even can pronounce his name, but very famous, respected journalist. So the fact that he recently, just this week or last weekend, he had his equipment taken away, and it sort of shed some light to the way that the Maduro administration or regime is currently treating Venezuela. So if he does this to one of the most recognized Latin American and American journalists in the world, like imagine what happens to Venezuelan reporters who are there. And so I know, and it seems like a lot of the tactics, and one interesting thing that I know it came up from one of the interviews is that it sounds like the Maduro regime is taking a lot of pointers and getting a lot of support from the Cuban regime, which has sort of been the old communist foe here in the Western Hemisphere.
I guess I think that sounds like a fair criticism of Maduro, but can we, for the sake of like trying to get to a deeper understanding of this, can we turn that around also and say that there seems to be an orchestrated um, blitz campaign against Maduro, where the narrative seems to be very common if you read Jorge Ramos, if you read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. It's like they're all saying the same thing. And to what extent do you guys think that Chavez kicking out these reporters and shutting down media companies? To what extent do you guys think that that's linked to the actual failed coup attempt that happened back in the early 2000s against him, and then that permanently left him with a sense that independent media was not so independent in the sense that it was always somehow influenced by external forces.
So I want to mention that, like, for me, the first time that I went to Venezuela, I also mentioned to Luis that I went to Cuba, where um where in Cuba, you could see people's fear in their face, where they couldn't speak against their government, and it was clear and evident. And when I first visited Venezuela, that wasn't the case. I felt that Venezuelans for a long time enjoyed a lot of freedom to express themselves, and there was no fear of being completely repressed. But I think what happened in terms of whether it was because Chavez was afraid of another coup or he was afraid of whatever it was, what happened is that they started taking a lot of the things that were happening in Cuba to Venezuela. Like they started learning from, obviously Chavez's mentor was Castro. And so that repression and that silencing of your own people to not speak against your government is, I don't think there's any justification for that. However you put it, like to, for me, just being in Cuba and feeling like I couldn't have an honest conversation because there was fear in people's eyes was just not the kind of society that I think anyone really wants to live in, whether you agree with the government or not, because to a certain point, and this is what you've seen in Venezuela, that there have been so many people that started off being supporters of Chavez and who just, continue to switch and leave that because of that, because they see the repression that's happening and that's happened that they didn't agree to. Like it's okay to agree with an ideology, but then when you start just seeing all your civil rights um, being shut down, I don't think anyone wants to live in that kind of society.
And so that's you're kind of contrasting it with Cuba, where you're saying that that seemed like the situation that's where Venezuela seemed to be headed, to a place where people no longer felt comfortable criticizing their own government out of fear of retaliation. Because
Yeah, I think I think it's a lot harder to do that in Venezuelan because you know, Cubans have had, and Cuba is it's an island, right? So what you've seen in Venezuela and what I wish we would talk about more was like the millions of people that have left Venezuela and the conditions that they've, like it again, risking it all to leave the country because their government is failing them.
and
And
that
so people, I mean, like you didn't have that case in, well, in Cuba you did, people tried, they went to the ocean, but here, Venezuela is not an isolated country. It's not an island like Cuba. So I think it's been a lot harder for them to instill that fear and that repression in their own people.
um, would we be able to offer a similar criticism of Mexico and all the Mexicans that have left Mexico as a result of corrupt government and policies there?
No, and Mexico is so completely different. In Mexico, people have always been able to openly criticize their government. And even though there's, we can talk about media being influenced and paid by who, and whoever has money has access to media, that in especially in Mexico, because there are, the media is a monopoly in Mexico. But the reality is that you can get on a bus and people are, like criticizing the government left and right. So there is no repression of people's political views in Mexico that's comparable to what's happening in Venezuela.
But you do have instances in Mexico also of the repression of those that are against the government, right? Like the 43 students that were disappeared, mainly because they were going to Mexico City for a protest, and it's been alleged that it was the government officials that intercepted them and handed them over to the drug cartels to essentially make them disappear. And so, would it be a more accurate representation, a more accurate description of Mexico? Would it be that the government doesn't really care as long as it doesn't it doesn't stand to spiral out of hand, or as long as it doesn't really become a major concern for them? But there definitely is political repression in Mexico as well. But I think
Yeah, but it's different. There's always and there's a lot of, other human rights violations in Mexico, specifically by the military. So yeah, I'm not saying that Mexico is a place that's completely free um of any type of government overreach or abuse, but it's a completely different situation than Venezuela.
yeah,
There's more freedom to really express yourself,
Yeah. So
um,
I sorry.
in general for the for the general population.
Yeah. I think we both agree on that. I think the reason why I mentioned just the fact that uh, I don't know how many people have left Mexico in the last 20 years as a result of just the economy getting worse for a lot of them. I was just drawing a parallel to the fact that people leave countries all the time, right? So if people are leaving Venezuela because of terrible government policies, it just seems like, yeah, that's something that it seems like it's sped up also, right, as a result of uh, the oil going down in price, because that economy is very heavily reliant on oil exports. The price drops, and all of a sudden things got a lot worse, and so more people have had to leave. But that in itself is maybe the large quantity of people that left in a
But
short period of time.
it's not the drop of the oil. What it really is the corruption within the government. And I think for me, again, coming from a place where I was very sympathetic and I'd consider myself, you know, kind of socialist left, when I started traveling and really seeing what was happening, and even in Cuba and in Venezuela, where you see that the people from the government, you know, even in a communist country, have so many more luxuries and benefits than the regular people. And so that's what's started happening in Venezuela. And that's why right now I think the military has not, at least a lot of the military officials have not turned against Maduro, is because of the large amount of corruption and money within the
Hmm.
people in power. And so what's happened in Venezuela is just the complete mismanagement
Right.
of the resources. It's not the price drop in oil that's created the crisis.
Right. And so I think I wanted to bring up this chart here because I wanted to see if we could, um, because I think the price, the drop in oil happened around 2014, right? So it looks like, at least this is just Venezuelan migration to Europe, but it looks like it's pretty steady. You already have a lot of people leaving each year, but then all of a sudden there's like a jump as a result of just the situation getting worse. And again, that's just mismanagement of the economy. A lot of fault can be placed in Maduro because of the way they're running it. So then that leads to more people suffering and more people leaving.
But it's not just the economy that, I mean, obviously survival is your number one instinct. So you, yes, you're going to flee in a place where you can't feed your family, but there's a lot of people that are political exiles.
Hmm.
And so that, I don't think that that's the case. Like when you try to make the comparison with Mexico, that's not the case in Mexico. It's been the case in other countries in Latin America, like Chile, during dictatorships, like what's happening in Venezuela. So there are other examples, but yeah, it's a political exile as well.
Yeah, but I think that, I guess what I'm trying to focus on is that we have a steady amount of people that are leaving for whatever reason. It could be economic, others could be because they're just fed up with the political situation. You can assume that there's going to be political exiles, but honestly,
I don't think it's just fed up. It's persecuted. And
we're
this is where my own personal belief lies in, because I've known people that don't want to leave Venezuela. And
right.
it's not because of money, but it's for fear
But
that they're
let's
going to be thrown in
Right,
prison.
but
And
let's try to break that number down a little bit though, like political exiles. So these are people that are actively, in some form or another, the government is out. Maybe it's even no longer safe for them to be there. If you have 160,000 people leaving, at least it seems like a year here, um, I would think that a very small percentage of those would be actual political exiles, because what's the profile of somebody that is opposing the government? Is it, it's not the poor people, is it? Because it's the poor people that Chavez was trying to like redistribute wealth to. Would it be fair to say that that the political exiles would be people that were already in the middle or upper class that didn't like the policies of like Chavez and Maduro in terms of like making things harder for them?
I mean, I think you have everything, but of course, the first people that leave are the people that whose private property gets expropriated, and who then are being threatened of being thrown in jail. Those are the first people that leave, right? And I think that what you're seeing now, it's more people leaving because of survival, like just even within the lower class people, the people without the resources who are walking,
Yeah, and
like, and I mean, I don't think there's any, um, I don't think you can just say that that's just, oh, the price of oil. And I mean, you're making it sound like Venezuela is, this place where, oh, there's just a mismanagement of funds and the drop in oil is causing all these people to leave. Like, no, there is like a serious, like, people have flee the i- because of everything, the repression, the lack of just being able to take care of their family, and it's the mismanagement comes, it's been happening for years, but I think it's finally exploding
yeah,
this
but
year.
I don't think I'm disagreeing with you. I'm just what I'm saying is that that immigration out of Venezuela seems to have, at least here to Europe, it seems to have gone up as a result of oil dropping, and oil is a huge part of the economy for Venezuela for exports, and as a result of it, you do have this cycle where okay, oil goes down, certain industries suffer as a result of that, the economic conditions of people get worse, and then as a result of that, the government has to tighten things, and it's just this cycle that keeps making things worse. And yeah, all the factors that you mentioned, um, some of them are independent of like maybe the economy or even oil, but the fact that oil went down and that it's such a big part of their economy seems to have also made everything worse. And so now you're seeing even more people fleeing the country, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I think, but it's, so it's both. It's not, like I said, it's not just the culmination of the oil prices that have gone down, but it's a culmination of also just people are fed up. People are just fed up with the government. People are fed up with the inefficiency, with the corruption, with the, like, just basically their freedoms, not being able to express themselves. So yeah, would that in itself cause someone to flee? Maybe not, but you add the economic crisis to that, and yeah, but
But Venezuelans, for the most part, though, like let's a typical Venezuelan, do they have the right to go out of the street and protest? Because I think I have seen some protests being organized by different opposition groups. In that situation, what's happening? Is the military going to get deployed, and is it going to try to crack down on every single protest, or like what's the actual state like in Venezuela when it comes to people having the freedom to go out on the street and express themselves?
I think you've seen that. I mean, for many years, people have taken to the streets to protest, and there's been repression, there's been confrontations, there's been um, people that have been killed.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I don't know the numbers, I don't know the exact numbers, but there's definitely people that have been killed. And
Let
but
me
yeah,
see.
people go out and protest and then suffer the consequences. And then also, if you want to look at maybe the number of prisoners, political prisoners, that's another area where I don't think we've mentioned. I think that no matter how you look at it, Venezuela is there's a dictatorship, and it's an authoritarian government, and it's a non-democratic government that silences the opposition, silences the anyone that um, dares to question the current government, or even, yeah. So I think that there's no way that you can say that Venezuela is a free country that follows the law, or a democratic country that
Mm-hmm.
holds elections.
Yeah,
That's all
but I
false.
guess usually when I get into conversations about things like Venezuela, but a lot of the, I mean, at least the thing that sticks out to me is that a lot of these things that you mentioned, maybe not to the same degree as they happen in Venezuela, but they certainly happen in other countries as well, Central America and Mexico, and sure, it's to a different degree in Venezuela, but it seems like because Venezuela is a socialist country that has always opposed like U.S. policy, it seems like that always gets painted as like the terrible poster boy for what socialism is, and how you don't want to live in. And even for me personally, I don't like the fact that my government here in the United States is so hypocritical when it comes to these matters, because on the one hand they say all the things that you're saying, which are correct. That Venezuela is this type of country, and there's just all these problems with it, and the leadership runs it a certain way. But then we turn around and we support countries like Saudi Arabia, and we support like their embargo of Yemen, which is actually there's a famine in Yemen that's killing thousands of people, and yet we still support Saudi Arabia. So there's no consistency in our foreign policy. And I don't disagree with you that Venezuela has a ton of problems. I just feel like okay, so do many other countries, and it seems like that's I guess what I'm kind of getting at is I'm kind of getting at this whole situation with Guaido that I do want to talk a little bit about, because the U.S. is ahead of the pack in terms of like supporting Guaido and calling for a change in the country. But maybe before we get into that, though, I don't know if maybe Eduardo or you, Joan, if one of you guys could kind of summarize just like the current situation in Venezuela with Guaido.
I'll defer to Joanne.
No, I don't want to talk. I mean, yeah, I'm going to say no. I don't really want to talk about the political process of the U.S. supporting Guaido or not, because I don't agree with the U.S. I don't agree with the U.S. intervening in Venezuela myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree with you where the U.S. picks and which country they want to get involved in based on their interests, and Venezuela is definitely a country that they want to get involved, not only because it's a socialist country, but also because it has a lot of oil reserves. And so that basis on that basis, the US determines what relationships it has with each country. So I totally agree with you. I don't agree with our government here in the US getting involved in Venezuela. I know that um, I know that the opposition is asking for the government of the US. The opposition is, but this is the thing, and that I think that we should also highlight that Venezuelans are asking from the support, not just from the US, but from all the countries. Guaido
Mm-hmm.
was in Brazil asking for Brazil's support. He was in
Right.
Colombia asking for Colombia's support. And those are the countries that I feel that have more a stake in the game, that should be more involved in seeing what's the transition in Venezuela. And because what, like, it's really difficult to think of what is the outcome here, right? What that's in the benefit of all the people, because if like, you can question Guaido's authority by saying, oh, he just named himself president based on the way that he interpreted the
Mm-hmm.
Constitution or not. But in reality, to me, that was like, whoa, that's great, because there is a way for a transition that's not having hundreds and thousands of people kill themselves
Mm-hmm.
in a civil war.
Yeah, but but this kind of gets to the reason why I wanted to talk about Guaido is that it seems to me like from the way that I see it, it doesn't seem like he came out of nowhere. I understand that the people have a lot of grievances against their government, but most people, like I think most people didn't know who Guaido was, and I think earlier you said that the people of Venezuela are asking for outside intervention. I haven't seen any polls as to like the number of people that actually support Juan Guaido. He did declare himself the interim president, and based
Look
on
at how
like,
many people attended the day that he got sworn in. That'll
mm,
give you just kind of, I mean, and it's not going to be everybody, right? But
right, but
he
what
definitely,
percentage?
and that's within Venezuela. Not even, I'm not talking about the millions of people that have fled that are in support of him, but.
Right, but
within.
we don't have an actual number because there's like millions of people. What's the total population size in Venezuela?
Well, then the other thing that you could look at is he's the president of the National Assembly. So the National Assembly had the majority. They beat um, Chavez, and so if you're talking about, that's another that's probably the best poll that you can look at is the results from the last election of the National Assembly where they had the majority, and that'll tell you how much support he has within the country. And obviously, he had enough support for Maduro to declare the National Assembly not, to strip them away of all their powers and create another, make up another institution that benefited him.
So that's I think that's also interesting. So when did Guaido become the president of the National Assembly? That was recently also, right? And you're saying that we have poll numbers for the amount of support that
Election results,
election
actually.
results are election results. These are protests. So
For
country
the last National Assembly election,
campaign.
not the fake
What do you mean fake?
elections that Maduro
So here are the
has.
results. So there was a 41% turnout for that. About 8 for family voted. Venezuelan oil company.
Well, while you look that up, I think
Yeah,
that one point I wanted to make is that, uh, and I haven't read up too much on Guaido, but it sounds like he had been involved at a very young age with the opposition roundtable, and Capriles had been imprisoned, right? So, but I think he's the type of person who was fascinated with politics, who has been involved in Leopoldo Lopez. And which one is the one that's descendant of Simon Bolivar?
that's Leopoldo Lopez.
Leopoldo Lopez, may he rest in peace, Bolivar. But in any case, well, I think to your point, I think Guaido um, may have seemed to come out of nowhere, but it seems like he was somebody who had been in the political game a long time, and he just happens to be a young, fresh voice who's representing his party and their perspective, and obviously it's not completely analogous to what happened with Barack Obama. But Barack Obama also came out of nowhere to be a state senator, to become a senator, to then sort of represent the a new Democratic Party back in 2008. So I think part of it is that, and I think may go to your point, Romero, that perhaps since we have not been following this issue as closely, or there's not as much coverage that gets to us, we just didn't know about Guaido because it wasn't covered, or a lot of the work that had taken place sort of happened behind the scenes or wasn't reported on.
From what I read about his election, it was a few weeks before January 5, and I think I had seen a number like 30% was the results that his party got. And what I read about him is that he wasn't even like the most um, like the top leaders within the party. That it seemed like he had been handpicked to be the new president. And again, because you just mentioned some of the qualities that he has, so he's like, you comparing him to Obama, the way he looks and so forth. And so what I'm trying to like. I'm not making those claims. I'm just asking those questions. Like, wait a minute. Like, okay, so where did this guy come from? What kind of support did he get? How many people knew him? And all of a sudden, were there other people that were better qualified than he was? Because so I looked at
So
this
if
wiki
you want to
page.
talk about the other people that are better qualified than he was, those other people are most likely in prison by Maduro or Chavez. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about all the political prisoners that, like that I don't think that you only find in really authoritarian countries, like so from the beginning and from since I've been following this, like that's one thing that they've done in Venezuela so well
Hmm.
that you don't see in other Latin American countries is just like really disqualified anyone that could potentially be a threat. So, I mean, I think that you exhaust any options that you have in terms of who your leadership is if all the people that have been, in the struggle or fighting within the opposition have been imprisoned.
Mm, I mean, that's a good point. That I mean, I'm not defending the way that Maduro and his government do things, but I'm kind of just trying to focus on this particular guy Guaido, because from what I was reading, he is part of a more radical fringe party that even within the opposition of the other opposition to Maduro,
Voluntad Popular.
yeah, Voluntad Popular, that even a lot of other parties don't even agree with them. They're like a fringe group. And this election that was contested by the election that they're calling fraudulent, and the whole basis for why Guaido is calling himself interim president, supposedly, at least from what I read, the other opposition leaders were okay. They signed off on the election. And these are opposition to Maduro, not just Maduro's uh, his group, which you would assume is there's some level of corruption there. But even the opposition, the only guys from what I read, the only guys that chose not to recognize the president is the Voluntad Popular, and they're in the minority in that. And also, didn't that group also refuse? Like they refused to participate in the latest like elections in Venezuela. Uh, and whereas all the other political groups are calling for like talks, let's say like let's have some discussions between Guaido and Maduro. It's Guaido that's the only one that's saying that there's no discussions, that he is the president and that there's no compromise. And that again, as soon as Guaido is declared interim president, the United States backs him, and Trump says right away too that, oh, we're not going to have any discussions. We're beyond discussions. Or was it Trump, or was it um, the vice president? I forget who in the administration said it. But that to me, when I start seeing stuff like that, that's what I'm saying. That it seems suspect that this isn't organic opposition that is coming out of Venezuela. This seems like there's more to it than that.
So what is your theory?
Well, my theory is that if I were to put together, is that Maduro is doing a crappy job of running his country, and some outside forces are exploiting it. And part of it is because of Maduro's own like incompetence and the way that they run the economy and the way that they have oppressed political opposition. But also, this isn't like all of a sudden the people in Venezuela got fed up with it, and then Guaido, because he's patriotic and he wants to help out the people, because he's even from like middle or upper class. Textbook pattern of like from the book 1984, how usually it's the middle class, those in power, that want to topple those others that are in power, and then they turn to the poor people, pretending like they're going to be their representative to just use them for their support. And that seems like a classic case of that, where um, Guaido comes out of nowhere, and not only is he's not in it for like the doesn't seem like he's in it for the benefit of the people. He's in it for himself and for power, and he's also compromised because he had a talk with who was it from the vice president, with Mike Pence. He had a phone call with Mike Pence the night before he declared himself the president. So he already knew that he was going to get the support of the U.S. So okay, so they're already talking. So what more was going on before this guy came into the scene? And how are external forces, mainly the United States, that is a bigger force, like pretty much we have a global empire. To what extent have we been um, kind of working and coaching and mentoring and getting this guy ready for this particular position? And it even goes beyond Guaido, like all of the political opposition that you guys are talking about in Venezuela and all of that stuff. To what extent was that organic, just stuff that is independent of outside interference, or what part of it can we put a blame on, like the United States actively trying to undermine this government ever since they tried to overthrow Chavez back in the early 2000s? And I don't have a complete answer. I'm just trying to piece together what's actually going on, because I know that what I'm hearing in CNN is not the whole story. They leave out a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like I said, for me, the thing is that regardless, even when the U.S., like yes, the U.S. has always been trying to intervene in all the countries where it has an interest, like I mentioned before,
Mm-hmm.
and I think you saw that early on with Chavez, but there was so much support for Chavez that at that time that the US couldn't really do anything about it. And also having, from my perspective, having worked where with US, I guess with US officials that were in charge of what's happening in Venezuela, I can tell you from a personal perspective that a lot of the times they didn't have a clue to what was going on. So I think that you're giving them a little bit too much credit by saying they handpicked this guy, they groomed him, they put him in this position. Honestly, like US officials are not that competent and they don't really know what's happening on the ground in Venezuela. So part of my job before was actually to inform people, and there were a lot of the times they were lost. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't know, who to support, who not to support. And so, part of we were feeding them information a lot of the time, people from Venezuela. So I think that your theory of like this is something completely staged by the US, I honestly don't believe that because I don't give that much, not because there's not a intention or desire from the US to actually do that. It's just I don't give them that much credit.
Yeah,
They don't have that competency in my opinion.
yeah, but I think we may be defining what external influence or orchestration is, because I'm not saying that this guy's handpicked them 20 years ago and they said in 20 years this is the guy that's gonna like rise up and so forth. I think that there's always active involvement, and you always support specific groups. You because it's the U.S. that was funding the Leopoldo Lopez's political group. It was the U.S. that was funding them ever since like 10, 20 years ago. And you don't pick one single person, you fund an organization, and then you maybe like there's a certain group of people that if the opportunity arises, you can go and you might be able to have some support there, so that you can then try to like bring up leaders that will then get elected and be more favorable to these neoliberal policies that the United States has spread throughout Latin America. So yeah, so it's not as complex as you're describing it, at least like in the sense that it's not as like surgical as you kind of described it, where like Guaido is the guy and he's been the guy for a while, because that's really hard. Like I don't think strategy works that way. I think strategy is like it's like the same thing as Vegas, right? When you go to Vegas, um, the strategy of Vegas is very simple. The odds are stacked against you. So whatever game you play, the house has like a over 50% chance of winning versus whoever's gambling. So that guarantees that in the long term that they'll make money. It's the same thing with the way that I see that this the external hand of the United States. What they're doing is they're just setting themselves up, creating the foundation for some type of opposition or something that will allow them to then exploit situations once they arise. So this situation is a perfect example. Like you have a disaster of maybe of my own Maduro's own doing, as you said. There's a lot of people that are rightfully pissed off, fleeing the country, and then they don't have any rights. And again, that's something that is further gets exploited by the United States. So the strategy works regardless, and you don't have to have a Guaido. You could have somebody else, but the foundation of what the strategy is, it's very clear to me that that's what's happening. Um, I mean, again, the reason why I, I say also this also is because this isn't just about Venezuela. Look at what happened in Syria. Look at what happened in Libya. Look at what's happening in Yemen. We have history. We have a history of this. And if we go back to like the Iraq War, and if we go back to what they were telling us before the Iraq War and what was happening, it's a pattern, right? So whenever I start seeing my government say, and then all the news media corp, companies saying the same thing, it's like right away I think, oh, I've seen this before. Where have I seen this before? Oh yeah, not too long ago, Afghanistan, Iraq. It seems very
Yeah, and
familiar.
but like the conversation we're having here today is about Venezuela, not about the US foreign policy because that's a different topic. And I agree with you, like I don't agree with US foreign policy for all the reasons that you've mentioned. But what I think that in terms of political movements and the
Mm-hmm.
political movement that's happening in Venezuela right now, it's not a creation of the US. And I've learned that political movements are something that are in no one's control. N- political parties and political leaders strategize and spend hours trying to figure out how to mobilize
Mm-hmm.
people, how to inspire people. But sometimes, honestly, and I've seen this from the inside, both here in the US to in other countries, there's no controlling to me, like political movements are kind of like weather. Honestly, there's some, like you're hoping that like you're hoping you're going to get a sunny day, or you're hoping you'll get a storm, but there's no way really to control it. Like, yes, afterwards, when, and I agree with you, once the movement starts, like you can propel it, and the US has definitely done that. And and not just the US, but a lot of other countries, you can propel it and push it, but the movements start in and of itself if it comes from like the people, and it's things that politicians a lot of the times do not cannot create.
No,
So I think that's what's happened in Venezuela. I don't think that this is something that was created by anyone other than Venezuelans.
yeah, no, I agree with you. I'm not saying that the situation there is created. External forces have some play in it, but I think what I'm saying is that the situation is being exploited. I agree with what you're saying because look at this French group that Leopoldo Lopez, this radical group I was reading about them. They seem to be like I said, a lot of even the opposition don't agree with their tactics because they're more violent, more confrontational, and this is the group that has been directly funded by groups in the United States, and the fact that they're a French group in Venezuela, it goes to your point that it's really hard to control movements. So yeah, I agree with that, but it's a lot easier to take advantage of a situation once it gets out of hand. And that's why I kept seeing this situation in the Colombian border, where all of a sudden Guaido is calling for humanitarian aid that they want to bring to the country. The real reason why they're doing that is because they want to create chaos. Because the minute you create chaos, it's easier to control people. It's easier to control the situation. As long as Maduro maintains order and the military doesn't start shooting people and none of that crazy stuff happens, Maduro, I don't think he's going anywhere because the only chance that Guaido has is by coming up with situations that are going to create chaos, because that's like the textbook strategy: create the chaos, and then you can easily come in and use that chaos to point at the government and say, "See, this is what they're doing, and this is their fault, and this is why we need to overthrow them."
I think the situation definitely with the aid was definitely politicized and used as a tactic to put pressure on Maduro, and kind of as a way to move the agenda forward. But I think what I'm really interested in, which I don't think there's an answer to, honestly, is what what are, what is the path to a transition where people are not suffering, are not starving, are not fleeing a country that has enough resources to feed its people, where there is a transition to, because Guaido, you keep on talking about him, but he's just, he's interim president, which means his job was to set up elections for future presidents. So it's not that, he just declared himself president forever. That would be following in the footsteps of Maduro. Um, so it's not, he's just the leader of the moment. Something can very much happen to him. Someone else could come in. It's not about him. It's really about, the will of the people, which what you keep on saying, Voluntad Popular is a French party. I think some people will disagree with you. I'm not here to argue which political party is a French party or not, but what, I think it is about la voluntad, de las personas, the will of the people. And it's like, how do you transition to something, to a government that is responsive to its people, a government that is taking care of all of its people,
Mm-hmm.
and that is holding democratic elections to select its leaders, and is allowing for a fair competition of the people that want to run. That's really what I'm interested in supporting and figuring out how we get there.
Uh, uh, I think I agree with everything you're saying. But would you say then that the way that that Juan Guaido has gone about it, do you think that's conducive to kind of like this ideal situation, or this path forward where we actually make progress? Because he
Yes, you know what I've seen with the upcoming of Guaido, which has been pretty remarkable, is the fact that for a long time following Venezuelan politics, the opposition was so divided. You know, for a long time they tried to have like La Mesa de la Unidad, all the opposition political parties come together, and there was always a struggle between generations too. You had the old guard, the old political leaders versus the new generation of like of Leopoldo Lopez and Voluntad Popular and Capriles. And so there was always a struggle within the opposition, and that's also why I think that Maduro and his government were able to really grasp control because there was no organized opposition. And so now, though, I do see that Guaido may it's to the benefit that he's not recognized or known by a lot of people because he's a fresh new face that has been able to not only unite the opposition but also get people that were once supportive of Maduro or the Chavismo government to like actually support Guaido now. And so I think that, like regardless of how long he's in power or not, I think that the situation has actually, in my opinion, been for the better of Venezuela. But
but
we still, obviously, it's an ongoing story, and who knows what's gonna happen next. But I do think, I honestly do think that this is the year where there's gonna be a transition and Maduro will be out of power.
but we don't have the numbers in terms of what support Guaido actually has with the people, or even with those within government. We know that the
So that's
military.
like I mentioned before, his job is to hold elections. So it doesn't even matter
No, but
what,
what I mean
like
is like,
hold fair and transparent elections and
right,
see who
right. But
wins.
I'm saying we don't know what the numbers are in terms of what the people, who the people that, what number of people support what he's doing and the way that he's going about it. Because
He united the opposition, which I think that's one thing that you can say that's true that wasn't before.
so all the opposition
So
is now united against, behind him, because that's not what I read.
yes,
That
yes, yes.
I'm gonna, is that recently? Because when I was reading it, it said that the opposition leaders were not in agreement with, because opposition leaders were actually trying to negotiate with Maduro, as opposed to saying that no, Maduro must go. But I'll read up on that again. Obviously, I'll double check it. But doesn't it bother you guys though that at some level the way that he's going about it? Because after all, he is self-declared. He went and said, your political
What I'm
party,
saying, the way you solve that problem is by holding fair and
right?
transparent elections,
But
which is what his mandate is,
no,
right?
but see, like
So,
everything, he stands on a shaky foundation, because he's the guy.
Maduro could run again and see if he wins,
But
but I don't think that will be the case.
but
But
let's just talk about the principle of what's happening here, right? You have a
no, because
government.
you know what, you're talking of the thing is that you have to understand you're basing like you're saying what he did was he claims that he's following the constitution. There's like and you said like no, he's definitely not, he just made this up. But I don't care what it is, Venezuela is not a country of laws right now. And
But
it's not a
neither
country
neither
that follows any laws.
but can we say that
It's not
about
a
a lot of
country that
countries though?
follows
So
any
that's my
procedures.
problem.
So there is, like, so having a loose interpretation of what the Constitution says to declare a transition and call for a free, fair, and transparent election to me is not outrageous.
But it sounds to me like you're saying that whenever we perceive any country not to have a constitution and not to be abiding by its own constitution, that it's fair game, and anyone within that government can rise up and say, "Hey, I'm now the interim president because these guys are doing corrupt things." Because we can point to every single country on this planet that they have a constitution and they don't always follow it line by line, even in the United States. And what bothers me, or what concerns me the most
So
is
it would be different if he was declaring himself to be president and, for a sixth term or for a new term. But when you interpret something, when you have like an authoritarian government and a dictatorship, and you try to, and you're calling for elections that are free, fair, and transparent, to me, that's a democratic process, right? If he was saying like, oh, I'm president for the next 6 years, then that would be problematic. But anyone that comes and says like, you know like I think everyone recognized that the elections where Maduro said he won were not fair, transparent, and were, manipulated. But if, so for me, I don't have a problem for that because there's an easy solution to that, which is let's hold elections.
right. But see, so then what happens though? Let's just take that natural to its natural progression. Based on this unanimous action, that Guaido did, which is, hey, I don't believe in this political party and the elections before, where there was a level of corruption in the elections and they weren't fair. So I'm gonna declare myself interim president so we can have new elections. Okay, we already know that in a country not everyone agrees. So what's gonna happen is you're gonna have new elections and there's gonna be a new winner, and then the opposition is going to cry foul and they're going to say no, the elections weren't fair, there was cheating, there was like repression, there were all these things,
Well,
and then
there's
somebody else is
mechanisms where there's independent third party
even
witnesses,
right, even but
observers.
even
And so it's not the opposition declaring like, oh, these were fraud and sham elections. It's what experts that go into, that have, and that's the type of work that I did, is when you have people that are not, that are pretty much like, a referee or an arbiter. ¿Cómo se dice?
arbiter, yeah, an arbiter.
Yes, exactly. You have someone like that be able to say, yes, these elections were, these were the irregularities.
Hmm.
This is, what happened, and based on data, actual data, were these elections
Okay,
um
but what if,
valid or not?
okay, so let's take the independent groups then. So we have new elections and we have
Hmm.
these independent groups that say that, yeah, you know what, we've vouched for these elections and they were legitimate. Okay, what's the
Hmm.
opposition going to do? The opposition is going to say, hey, no, wait a minute, these independent groups were funded by external forces. They were receiving funding from like the US or from other countries. We don't consider their results legitimate. Therefore, based on the precedent that Guaido has already established, somebody else is going to come along and say, no, this party in power is illegitimate because the elections were illegitimate. I now declare myself interim president and we should have new elections. Because that's exactly what this is. Like, how do
No,
you draw the
no, I
line?
don't think that. I don't think that's the
On
case.
the
I think there's standards. There's international
right,
standards for
but the
what
only
elections
people
are free, fair, and transparent. And if you have a party that disagrees, like you have data. It's data to back you up. It's not um but yeah, there's always going to be a risk that people don't agree with it. But
which they
again,
won't.
at the end of the day, honestly, like if you allow the voice of the people and the vote of the people, they will select their own leaders. And yeah, that's the only thing that's what I hope for Venezuela, is that that's what happens, is that the people from Venezuela get to decide who's gonna be their leader and
Hmm.
what kind of country they want to live in.
So I'm going to do some research on the organizations that are declaring the past elections fraudulent. And so I think if I look deep enough into those
Well,
organizations,
first of all, you have the thing is like, so most countries uh allow for international election observers or for domestic election observers. I don't think Venezuela is a country that has allowed that in since Chavez. So in order to let yeah in order to figure out what like in order to figure out if an election was free, fair, have to first be able to
Wait,
observe it and collect data, and
but
that's hasn't been the case in
doesn't
Venezuela.
that then doesn't that discredit Guaido's entire argument if he is quoting organizations that you're saying are not international, which means that they're
Well,
not
if you
impartial?
want to look at of the fairness of election, I'm one of the things, even without getting to the election day, is who are the candidates that are allowed to run. And when you have in jail people that are, that would be running, and when don't allow them to run, that alone right there tells you that that's not a fair election.
Right, but I mean, if I look at these people that were jailed, am I gonna find compromised relationships there, conflicts of interest? Like people don't get jailed just because they stand against a government. That there's a
Yes, they
number of
do. In
reasons.
Venezuela, they do.
Right, but if I look at all these people, I'm sure I'm gonna find some that are like actively trying to undermine, with the help of external forces, the current government. So I'm not even with the case of elections. I'm not disagreeing with you that like I wish that the Venezuelan people had fair elections and that they could just choose their own party. And I don't even support what Maduro's saying. I'm just my point is that the way that Juan Guaido went about it, if you follow that, it doesn't go anywhere good because people will always try to exploit the situation to their advantage. Even if you have new elections, even if you bring in international observers, someone's going to say that they're not valid, that they're not fair, that there was cheating. And then, based on the same precedent that Guaido established, somebody else can just declare himself interim president. It
But they're
doesn't
not
have
going to
a
have the
solution.
support of the people, and that's what makes it
But
valid,
Guaido
and
doesn't
that's
have the
what makes a
support of the
movement.
people either. I mean, the
Um,
people voted for Maduro, right? So why don't we just say that this election was fair? People chose Maduro,
because
and
it
then
wasn't
not even
fair.
right. But
Because
then
you can't make things up. It wasn't a fair election,
right, but
and
elections are never fair. That's my point. Like on principle, how do you stop this from repeating itself again the next time you have elections? I don't think you can.
again, I think that there are standards, there's processes, there are procedures, and that's what a democratic government is, and that's what a democratic
Okay,
government
so let's say this then.
has.
Let's say that
So
hypothetically there's new elections, somebody wins that is not an ally of the United States. Somebody else declares himself interim president. The United States backs that new guy along with all the international community that just follows the US. And now you have the same problem all over again.
I don't think the international community just follows the US. I think you're mistaken
Have you seen
in
what
that
happened with
point.
Huawei? So all of a
I'm sorry?
sudden, have you seen what happened with the Chinese company Huawei, the telecommunications company that it had contracts with all these international companies to set up 5G networks in the countries, and all of a sudden, because the United States told them, we don't want you to do business with China because of whatever reason, Canada, the UK, Australia, all these other companies all of a sudden just canceled their contracts with Huawei, even though Huawei is going to set up 5G networks that are cheaper and more advanced than whatever else is out there. So there's a lot of influence that is exerted by the United States and other countries, and
Yeah,
that's
but I think then you got to have a conversation about China's internal practices and whether or not how they use that technology. They're spying on their own people, setting up surveillance,
yeah. But in
but all those things. So I think
what I'm
it's been a long-ranging conversation, and I think it's about the right time to wrap our podcast today. So we'd love to hear what are some of the closing thoughts or follow-up items that come or action items that come from this conversation. So let's go with our guest Joanne.
No, I think that, it's pretty simple. I'm not here to talk about whether the US should back Guaido up or not, or what's, like, to me, it's about Venezuela, and it's about what's best for the Venezuelan people. And obviously, what they've gone through and what they continue to go through, it's heartbreaking and it's devastating, and there's no way to justify it. There's, like, I want to see an outcome where it's really they're able to express themselves freely, they're able to elect their leader freely, and just understanding that everything is always going to happen in a geopolitical situation, that there's always going to be countries with different interests that are supporting or not supporting, but that's besides the point. I think that the people from Venezuela can create the change that they want, and that's what they're doing right now. And I know that this year there's going to be a transition and that there is going to be change. And yeah, like I just hope that it happens peacefully, that there's no more shedding of blood unnecessarily. And that's kind of what I want to see. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for thanks for joining us. Thanks for the conversation. I agree with you on everything. As I've been saying, my main point has been I don't like my external government getting involved. So that's the one thing that I do have in opposition to. But in terms of what you said about letting the wishing that things get better for the Venezuelans, that they can have more democratic elections and so forth, I'm with you on that, and I hope that is something that they have in the future. And I mentioned Huawei in at the end. I think maybe that's something like a good topic for a different conversation. The relationship with China.
Yes, I think that as the second largest economy and everything that's going on geopolitically with them will be fascinating to have a conversation about China and the U.S. and obviously Latin America and so many other countries.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all and hope you enjoyed this conversation. Again, this was the Brown Perspective.